my presentation about the slasher film. I'm Dr. June Pulliam. I teach English and gender studies and screen arts at LSU, and one of my areas of specialty happens to be the slasher film, so I was really pleased that I was invited to come talk to you today about the slasher film, which I know way too much about. So, okay, all right, so first things first, what is a slasher film? So a slasher film it's a subgenre of horror where a serial killer, he murders a series of victims, usually with a bladed weapon, like the chef's knife that you so often see and you think of when you think of a slasher film, something like Psycho, for example, like the picture I have here. So, but as the genre evolved, its killers became more creative with their murder weapons of choice. So, you start seeing things like chainsaws, axes, knife fingers, and the like. And some slashers even strangle or bludgeon their victims to death, but usually they have a preferred way of killing that involves the use of some kind of weapon, but this is very important, they don't have a gun. They never use guns because guns aren't sufficiently personal. So the slasher wants to murder people in this really personal way. So a brief history of the slasher film. The genre really begins, yes?
Where does the definition come from?
Oh, where does it come from? I just kind of looked at a bunch of stuff and put it together, and it came from my own mind.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you can find all kinds of sources online, but that's probably the most commonly agreed upon way I can say it. And
It intrigued me. I thought there was like a movie standards body that was somehow associated with film things that said this is the formal definition of it.
No, there's all kinds of fights about that. But no, there's no movie body that says it has to have X, Y, and Z to be a slasher film. So some of the characteristics I'm going to talk about that the slasher film has in common, they vary depending on what era the slasher film is from. And really the easiest thing that I could most comfortably say about a slasher film, it's about a serial killer who uses a blade-like thing or something that's not a gun to kill his victims. And until recently, most slashers are male. They're overwhelmingly male. So, both Peeping Tom and Psycho, they're the beginnings of this genre. These are works that were made in 1960. You've probably heard of Psycho. It's one of Alfred Hitchcock's most famous films. Peeping Tom, you could be forgiven if you haven't heard about it. It was made by director Michael Powell, who was relatively famous in the UK at the time. And this film really tanked his career for a while, but we really didn't hear about it a lot in the United States until it got a cult following and, later became better known. But, just going on both of these films and then later ones, here's some things that you will find common to slasher films. So the killer, first of all, is a psychotic product of a sick family, but still recognizably human in some form. The primary victims are beautiful, sexually active women. The location is not home, but at the terrible place. And later, this not home can be transformed. Home can be transformed into the terrible place, given the right people and circumstances. The weapon is something other than a gun, and attacks are from the victim's point of view and occur with shocking suddenness. And then we have the final girl who survives the maniac's wrath. She's either virginal or not sexually active at the time. That's going to get a little bit more complicated. So starting with Psycho, so when Hitchcock wanted to make this film, he was a well-known director, but he pitched the idea to Paramount, the studio he'd been working with, and at first they weren't really enthusiastic. They said, no, that's disgusting. We don't want you to make a film about that. So he pitched it again, and they agreed by giving him a much lower budget than he normally would have gotten. He took as compensation 60% in whatever profits this brought in, which turned out to be a really good deal for him. You know, because he had such a low budget, he shot this film in black and white. He didn't really use people who were known stars at the time. Janet Leigh and Tony Perkins were up-and-coming stars. And he actually used some of his regular cast members from Alfred Hitchcock's Presents, a popular television series at the time. Also the score, you know, that iconic score, those kind of stabbing sounding strings, was a matter of budgetary concerns as well, because, you know, he didn't have the money to hire a full orchestra, so he just hired a string quartet to make this, this score for him. So, you know, and you know what happens in Psycho. So, but when Psycho was first released, it received mixed reviews. The critics weren't really enthusiastic about it, but they had to kind of change their mind when this film ended up being the, you know, third grossing film of the year in the United States. And, you know, audiences really loved it. So Psycho ended up being nominated for 4 Academy Awards that year. And since then, you know, the Library of Congress has selected it for one of the notable films that gets preserved. And, you know, it's just an iconic film. So Peeping Tom also had, you know, negative criticism, but it was really negative. This destroyed the director's career for about a decade. And, you know, it really didn't take off until later on when it became a cult film and people could appreciate it in hindsight, you know, after a lot of time had passed and, you know, there were many cultural changes. What was shocking to people in 1960 was really not that shocking in the 70s or the 80s. But the thing that upset people about it in the 60s, and he had to censor some parts of it, was it had what was considered to be overly violent and graphically sexual content. When I say graphically sexual, the things that were considered graphically sexual in this film are just, you know, there's a woman lying on a bed in lingerie. It's kind of it. So, you know, it's like in Psycho, when I was a kid, before we had VCRs or anything like that, guys would occasionally boast that, you know, they saw Psycho maybe at a late night screening or something, and they actually saw Janet Leigh's nipple in the shower scene. And then when VCRs became common and you could rent a copy of that film and freeze it, it wasn't there. So that was kind of this urban legend that grew with people seeing that. But the way Hitchcock had to shoot that scene to get past the censors, it was just amazing. You know, because he shows her naked, but there's nothing the censors can find objectionable in that scene because of how he shoots it. So, you know, but Peeping Tom did eventually develop this cult following, and, you know, since then the British Film Institute has selected it for inclusion in, you know, one of its iconic films, and it's like they listed it at the 78th best film of all time. So. All right, so the final girl character changes in the second phase of the slasher film. And this begins with Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. Excuse me. So, you know, before this, final girls were rescued in the end. If you remember the ending of Psycho, Lila Crane, Marion's sister, is rescued at the last minute by Sam Loomis. In Peeping Tom, his final victim is rescued by the police. But in the second phase, women have to rescue themselves because the men who would rescue them are all dead. And so, you know, what happens here is, let's see. Well, you know, Sally rescues herself basically by running as fast as she possibly can until she finally gets away. And, you know, there's what I call probably the longest scream in the history of cinema, when she runs down the driveway with Leatherface chasing her and runs back up and runs back down again before she can escape. But she's got to save herself. There's nobody else around there. So one of the essential elements of a slasher film is, of course, our killer. So the killer, who's almost always male, is in a state of gender confusion in that his masculinity is an issue. So when I talk about gender confusion here, I'm not talking about somebody being transgendered or anything like that. I'm talking about a character who is unable to live up to his culture's ideas of normative masculinity, whatever those things are. That's what I mean by gender confusion. So, he's the psychotic product of this sick family, and he's either erotically attached to his mother, like Norman Bates, or his maturation is stunted because of his attachment to his sick family. Keeps him permanently locked in the sexlessness of childhood. So, here I've got a picture of Leatherface up here, and one of the masks he wears. Often in this film, he has to function as the family mother. He's the one who has to prepare the meals, and when he does this, he puts on this wig and he puts on the face of a woman that he's skinned, and does a really bad job of putting on his lipstick. But here he's also, you see him in kind of a state of gender confusion. He's wearing stereotypically masculine clothing as well. But he's kept locked in this state of arrested childhood his whole life. He can't really speak very well, but all he knows how to do is slaughter things and kind of cook them. And his family's really not that much more functional, but so he's kept at home. Violence for the killer are alternatives to rape, and it's through this violence that the killer tries to resolve, at least temporarily, his gender distress. By controlling a woman, especially through violence. He feels like, well, he's a man because he's achieved this one hallmark of normative masculinity, which is control over women. But it's only temporary, and he has to keep, doing it. Lather, rinse, repeat. He never really is able to satisfactorily resolve his gender confusion. Then, we've got a couple of types of killers. The killer can be either what we call an inside man or an outside man. So an inside man is somebody who could just pass among us and seem normal. Like you think about Norman Bates, right? When he's not Norman Bates, in his mom's dress and wig and with a knife. And he's a little weird, but if you passed him on the street, it's just kind of normal. And you see that in other slasher films too, not just the first wave ones. But then we have outsiders too. The type of killer who, if you pass this person on the street, you'd get a bad vibe. There's just something off about this person. Here's a picture of Michael Myers from the original Halloween. And this mask that he wears is interesting because, this looks like what a stereotypical man is supposed to look like, except for the white paint. But he's got this emotionless face, almost featureless. And in fact, the mask that was selected for Michael Myers to wear was a William Shatner mask. And the people making the costume decided, let's just take this and spray paint it white. And it kind of worked. So, but yeah, here we have Michael Myers, and if you pass this guy on the street, like even if you didn't realize that was a mask, you would feel just something is not right. He puts off these menacing vibes, so he's an outsider. And outsiders, they not only can't really pass among everybody else, they lurk in the shadows. They're also really superhuman in some ways, in their near indestructibility. Michael Myers, for all intents and purposes, has supernatural powers in the Halloween franchise, because you can't kill him. He gets a knitting needle in the eye, he gets shot in the first film, and he's still not dead somehow. And he doesn't die. You can't get rid of him. And we only catch sight of the killers in glimpses that are kind of few and far between, kind of in the shadows. So then we have the terrible place. So the terrible place, sorry, I was trying to make this bigger so I can see it. The terrible place is most often a house or a tunnel in which the victims sooner or later find themselves. And, and they're really vulnerable. So what makes these houses terrible is not just their Victorian decrepitude maybe, but the terrible families, incestuous, cannibalistic, etc., violent, that inhabit them. The terrible place might at first seem like it's a safe haven when it turns out to be this terrifying, terrible place. So, for example, in something like Nightmare on Elm Street, and it takes place in the middle of, generic suburban America in a suburban home. What could possibly be dangerous in a home like that? Well, it quickly becomes the terrible place because, Freddy is supernatural and he gets to his victims through their dreams. So anything can become a terrible place. And then we have the weapons, of course. And I talked about how, they usually like, things that are sharp, pointy, maybe blade-like, anything but a gun. Because the killing has to be personal. And with a gun, you can shoot somebody from far away. It's not as personal. So, and then we have victims. And, what these victims are like, too, is important. So the primary victims are women. And they get the most screen time. But men die, too. But when they die, their deaths are represented differently and they die for different reasons. So, for example, in Psycho, the detective who's goes into the Bates house trying to see if he can interview Mrs. Bates, he has a death by misadventure. Norman kills him just because he's got to shut him up. But his death really doesn't take up that much screen time. It's not very memorable. Same thing in Nightmare on Elm Street. When Rod dies, Tina's boyfriend, he gets hung in a cell, but it doesn't get a lot of screen time. And even later when Glenn dies, he's sucked into the bed, like there's a wood chipper in there and he's just blown out as bloody chunks. It's not nearly as graphic as when Tina is killed, because she's dragged by an invisible hand up a wall, across a ceiling, and just stabbed and opened up in ways that are like really more intimate than anything you could even see in, say, pornography, because we're seeing things that are usually not available to see, like the insides of people's bodies. So women die because they're viewed as transgressors in their cultures. So, for instance, Norman Bates murders Marion Crane because she's run away to be with her lover. And, the mother half of him is always telling him about, how these bad women are and they're going to seduce him. So, he kills her because she has wrong sex. And we find out at the end of the film that there are other women who've gone missing, runaways, and, from the way they're described in the film, the lack of attention the police even put towards trying to solve those crimes, we can tell that they're suspected of having wrong sex and nobody cares about them. So, they're kind of treated like, well, what do you expect? It's their own fault. And in Peeping Tom, Mark Lewis murders mostly sex workers. In Halloween, 6-year-old Michael Myers kills his older sister Judith after she has sex with her boyfriend, and then comes back 15 years later to kill Laurie Strode's friends, especially her female friends who are all busy having sex with their boyfriends that night instead of babysitting like they should be. So, these are some of the killer's victims. But it's different for girls, because women and men are killed differently. There's Tina being killed all over the place. The men are just kind of dispatched quickly. The women are killed in this really graphic detail. And it kind of looks like, they're being punished for wrong sex. So then we've got the final girl, and she's the one who lives, the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and her own peril. We hear her scream, we see her chased, cornered, wounded, cowering in fear and running. She's abject terror personified. And her near-death scenes are nearly always the film's final climax. So she's presented from the outset, too, as the film's main character, She's the Girl Scout, the bookworm, the mechanic. So she's somebody who is also not stereotypically feminine, at least according to the standards of her peer group, which would be other teenage girls. So, unlike her girlfriends, the final girl is not sexually active. She's either a virgin or at the moment she's just not in a relationship with anybody. So in the second phase of slasher films, the final girls are also not normatively feminine. They're described as being boyish in that, maybe they don't dress in a really feminine way. Maybe they're kind of slender, their figure hasn't developed yet as much as their peers. They have knowledge that's usually associated more with men than women. For instance, in Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy. Man, I can't believe how fast Nancy can build a booby trap in 20 minutes with all of those things. I'm impressed she can even lift that big sledgehammer to get it positioned just right so it's going to hit somebody in the head. But, she's got all this kind of knowledge that her peers don't have. But she's also feminine. And that femininity is usually demonstrated in these films by, in the words of Carol Clover, who's written a lot about slasher films, by what's called tits and a scream. You see her topless and she screams. And these are both markers of her femininity. She's scared and, clearly she's got female body parts. So, what's important in these films is, first, the final girl and the killer, they've got something in common. They have this shared masculinity that's materialized in all those phallic symbols, like the knives and things like that, and also a shared femininity that's materialized in what comes next. The castration, literal or symbolic, of the killer at her hands. So she, things that she might do that are symbolic castration might include putting out his eyes, cutting off his hand, impaling his body or his belly, or even slicing or biting away his genitals. But the final girl hasn't just manned herself, as it were. She specifically unmans an oppressor whose masculinity was in question to begin with. And it is the male killer's tragedy that his incipient femininity is not reversed, but completed through castration, and the final girl's victory that her incipient masculinity is not thwarted, but realized through her phallization, which occurs when she, just even picks up his weapon or stands up and fights for herself. So I want to talk now about sexism in the slasher film. Many critics of the slasher film point out that, only the virgin survives in most slasher films. And so this somehow indicates that the film endorses regressive notions of gender. And I'm not saying that view is completely wrong, but these critics don't have a really nuanced understanding of the final girl character. One thing they don't acknowledge right away is the final girl is also targeted by the killer. So, the killer's not really thinking, oh, I'm going to leave you alone because you're not having improper sex. He targets her as well. And she lives not because virginity gives her some kind of magical power, like she's a unicorn or something. Instead, she lives because, unlike her sexually active peers, she's not distracted. She's paying attention to what's going on. When Laurie Strode's friends are supposed to be babysitting on Halloween night the way she is, and they're, bed hopping between houses to go have fun with their boyfriends, Laurie is staying at home watching all the kids that everybody else is supposed to be watching, and she's paying attention to what happens as well. So this is what really saves her. She's paying attention. And, that's pretty important. And she's not really trying to prove that she's an adult by having sexual relationships. Instead, she's no less adult, she's more responsible, but she's not a follower. She doesn't just heedlessly do what her peers do. So she is paying attention. She's aware of what's going on, which is important in allowing her to live. So In fact, in the slasher film, stereotypical femininity is often an important survival strategy. So, especially in the second phase films. So for instance, I talked about Sally Hardesty in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She runs and hides and she can jump. I forgot if this picture is from her first or second jump from a window in that film. She jumps through windows twice while she's running. And, one of them, she jumps from a second-story window, doesn't manage to break anything, or maybe she's just so scared she doesn't feel it, and wow, I wish I could run that fast. But in The Stepfather, one of the lesser-known slasher films that I really like, Stephanie Mayne lives because she also runs and hides. The house that has become the terrible place has been made the terrible place because her mother married this man, brought him into their lives, and he likes to, when his expectations of family life aren't met, and they're really high expectations, he gets frustrated and he just kills them off and marries into a new existing family. So, when he arrives, the family home becomes a terrible place, but she's got an advantage. She knows this house in ways he doesn't. So at one point, she runs up and hides in the attic, and he goes up there to try to get her, but she knows where to hide, and she's able to escape. And, finally she's able to buy enough time so that her badly wounded mother can kind of crawl up and join her, and together they do away with the stepfather. But usually being feminine is a strategy for getting killed in most films, especially American films, right? Where, the gun is almost this magical thing. You don't need any training, you don't need to practice. I hate it when people have like a big gun and they're firing it like this with one hand, and it's a little snub nose, and it's gonna hit a target 80 feet away, which is just so silly. But that's kind of a typically masculine trope, especially in American cinema, that guns are magical when you pick them up, and and you can shoot wherever you mean to shoot, and the bullets don't ricochet, they don't take out somebody else, nothing's messy. So in the third phase of slasher films, we start seeing parodies, and parodies can't really exist in any genre until there's been enough of that genre to establish a set of well-known rules among fans. So, some examples of parodies in this genre would be Scream, The Final Girls, of course, Cabin in the Woods, and the little-known Student Bodies from 1981. Parodies actually started early, but the better-known ones come a little bit later, at the end of the 90s. But in these parodies, they have to know the rules in order to break them. So, here's where horror and repetition comes in. A lot of people like to hate on slasher films. They like to hate on horror in general because they say it's always the same thing. You always know what's going to happen. Like this doesn't happen with any other genre fiction. Like westerns, romances, and, space operas. There's always a set of rules, right? But that repetition is actually important to the viewers too. As this genre and any genre kind of plays out in the various versions that are made in it, what you have are people kind of deciding what's important to keep and what do we throw away. And in horror, what makes it critical enough to pass along, to repeat and even parody its conventions, is its engagement of repressed fears and desires and reenactment of the residual conflict surrounding these feelings. So, as really well-known horror critic Robin Wood put it, horror films are both the personal dreams of their makers and the collective dreams of their audience, the fusion made possible by the shared structure of a common ideology. And the slasher film's crudity and compulsive repetitiveness give us a clearer picture of current sexual attitudes than do legitimate products of the better studios. So, the slasher film, kind of unmediated by any other worldly fantasy, cover plot, bestial transformation, or civilized routine, present us in startlingly direct terms with a world in which male and female are at desperate odds, but in which at the same time, masculinity and femininity are more states of mind than body. So they're kind of ahead of their time in a lot of ways as far as how they think about gender. And part of the thrill of the slasher film lies precisely in the resulting intellectual uncertainty of sexual identity. Okay, so the Final Girls. In the Final Girls, Max finds herself trapped in the slasher films that her mother could never live down. You know, the Camp Bloodbath film. And when Max and her friends intermingle with the characters of Camp Bloodbath, first of all, the sexual mores of the 1980s and the 2010s are contrasted. You know, Max and her friends argue about who among them is really technically a virgin. It's not like a yes or no answer. It's a lot more difficult to answer at this time because, you know, we're aware of more things that might complicate that term. But also, when Kurt accuses Chris of being a fag because he's not okay with Kurt's objectification of female camp counselors, Chris informs Kurt that his fathers are gay, and Kurt's just, he can't believe this. But with Camp Bloodbath ends with Max emerging as the film's final girl, and she and her friends haven't escaped this parallel universe, you know, we know something else is at play here. You know, she and her friends wake up in the hospital to discover that they're now trapped within the sequel, Camp Bloodbath 2, Cruel Summer. So for these characters then, there's really no escaping the slasher film because the world of the slasher film isn't really a parallel universe. While sexual mores have changed, sexism still shapes their lives. The figure of the slasher then represents all forms of violence, you know, whether physical or legal or anything else, that are still used to coerce women into subordinate gender roles. So it's like there's no escaping for them. So then there's the fourth phase of the slasher film. In the fourth phase, women become slashers. And this fourth phase of the slasher film emerges along, you know, the same timeline that the third phase emerges. It's just kind of a different way of looking at it. So, but yeah, so some examples of this fourth phase would be Almost Mercy, which if you didn't see it on Netflix in 2015, you probably missed it.
I Spit on Your Grave.
Yeah, that's a rape revenge film. It's not exactly a slasher film, but yeah, that's a great film. And I just watched another one that's like it last night, Ms. 45, which is on Shudder right now, which is also really good. It's another rape revenge film. And you know, some of these fourth phases of the slasher film have a lot in common with the rape revenge film. Because, and well, you know, some others are Teeth, which you may or may not have heard of, Jennifer's Body, High Tension, which is a French film that, you know, came out in 2003. You could be forgiven if you didn't see it. And Friday the 13th, and Urban Legend. Yeah.
Really into Friday the 13th. That's my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, but remember who the slasher is in Friday the 13th, the first one.
Yeah, she's a girl.
It's not Jason Voorhees, it's his mother, who's come back for revenge. So, you know, and, but, you know, so, for instance, in High Tension, the female slasher imagines she's the typical male slasher while she kidnaps and terrorizes the girl she loves, killing her family and anyone who would try to help her. Like, I've got this image here. I don't know if it's going to work as a, nah, it won't work. It's a GIF, but it shows, you know, this is the actual killer here, the woman who's got an axe, and this is who she imagines is terrorizing herself and her girlfriend, holding them both hostage. Well, not her girlfriend, the girl she loves, but you know, he's kind of this outsider slasher. We never see his face, and he's the kind of guy, if you passed him, you would just get bad vibes from him. But you know, in all these fourth phase films, the female slashers, they have their reasons for killing. I'm not saying it's justified, but they have their reasons. So, you know, in Urban Legend, for example, Brenda Bates becomes the slasher of urban legends, such as The Hook. And, you know, her reasons aren't very well articulated. It's basically, you know, well, she wants a chance to do this, I guess. So, you know, everybody thinks the killer is a man, but it's a woman, and she just goes around and kind of, like Candyman in some ways, keeps the legend of the Hook alive. And, you know, the urban legend of the Hook is actually the, you know, one of the bases of both the slasher film and Candyman. So, and in Friday the 13th, Pam Voorhees, you know, she takes revenge against the camp counselors at, you know, the place where her son died in 1957. Why she wants to hold these people responsible so much later, I don't know, but she does. So, you know, she's doing this because she's upset about her son. So, Teeth. If the slasher film and the rape revenge film had a baby, it would be Teeth. So in Teeth, Dawn, who is simultaneously the film's slasher and the final girl, was born with a special set of teeth that protects her against sexual assault. And at the end of the film, oh, I've got the wrong name in here. Dawn is seen leaving town after accepting a ride with a lecherous old man, after she has already dispatched everybody who has tried to sexually assault her or who has sexually assaulted her with her special teeth. And so she's just kind of hitching a ride out of town. We know what's going to happen to that guy. He thinks he's got her trapped in that car, and she's just going to go off and I guess keep doing this until she gets caught, if that's even possible. So then, in Almost Mercy, this is more of a revenge film in some ways, but it's kind of a slasher film too. So Emily and Jackson, they've been best friends since grade school, and they're both school misfits. And, you know, both are bullied by their peers and teachers and are either abused or ignored by their parents. And her best friend Jackson, he is so bullied that he's on target to become the next school shooter, and he's planning all this. He's got all these guns, and the only reason he gets caught is because he chickens out at the last minute. And he's sitting in a jail cell, and Emily just can't take anymore. She's been through a lot of things too, including being raped by the football team, and nobody will do anything about it, and they blame her. So she just gathers up all of Jackson's weapons, and she goes and dispatches these people one by one until she's able to get Jackson out of jail, give him some money to go off and start a new life, and then she just stays in jail. She's in a mental institution at the end of the film, where she says she's fine, nobody will try to mess with her. Jennifer's Body actually has two slashers. First, you got Jennifer Chet, the most popular and desired girl in school at Devil's Kettle High. And then her best friend, Needy Lesnicki, is also a slasher. So Jennifer becomes a killer after the emerging band Low Shoulder kidnaps her to use in a virgin sacrifice to some dark entity that will give them, you know, fame. And they become really famous, but the problem is Jennifer's not even a backdoor virgin. So she doesn't really just die. Instead, she's possessed by this demon, and she wanders around in her regular body, seducing men, and becomes this literal femme fatale, killing a string of men in Devil's Kettle until, you know, she finally kills her best friend, Needy's boyfriend, and then Needy's just had enough and has to, you know, Needy's got to take her out of this world. So when, and you know, I mean, Jennifer even tries to kill Needy at one point because, as she says, I go both ways, which is kind of a nod to the actress Megan Fox. But so Needy kills her and is put in a mental institution where she gets written on her chart that she's known as a kicker, because apparently she's got supernatural kicking powers, and eventually she just levitates and kicks her way out of this mental institution. And the last we see of her, she's already hitchhiked to a Low Shoulder concert, killed all of the band members in their hotel room to kind of avenge what happened to her friend. And then there she is in this last scene. It's not a really great scene, but if you can tell, what's really important in this scene is she's looking at the security camera. She's looking out at the audience. She's broken the fourth wall, which is just an absolutely terrifying moment in any kind of horror, when the monster breaks the fourth wall and looks out at that audience. And it kind of indicates that, well, Low Shoulder was only the beginning. And, you know, maybe she's going in the same direction, say, as Dawn in Teeth. We don't really know. But, you know, this is, you know, these are the slasher films. The slasher film as we currently know it today, and how it's evolving, especially in how it represents women in much more complicated roles. They've gone from being victims to more complicated characters if they decide to kill, where it's not so easy to dismiss their reasons for killing people, because you know they're killing in response to something that was done to them or one of their friends. And you know, I'm not trying to make a legal defense for anybody here, but you know, at least we have a motive that's a lot more clear than, say, like why Leatherface and his family killed people in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, all right, well, do you all have any questions for me? Yeah.
When it comes to the modern interpretation of the slasher, where the slasher can be female, I've always seen that as like a comment on how a lot of people, especially women, will buy into patriarchy to play with, like, try to quote unquote empower themselves, and what they're really doing is just playing to stereotypes. And it's just, I wanted to know if you had like an opinion about like that interpretation.
I mean, I do see how you know, women, especially in the fourth phase of the slasher film, do buy into some other bad negative stereotypes about women, like if they're angry, it's going to blow up the whole world, because if there's any emotion that women are not allowed to express, it's anger. You know, that is like the most unfeminine of emotions, and culturally we silence women who express their anger. We belittle them, or we don't believe them. And, you know, so when they become really this angry, on one hand, they're buying into this other idea of this, you know, monstrous idea, but sexist idea of women as just irrational creatures who have to be controlled for their own good. But then on the other hand, you know, you're also seeing how they're responding to a set of circumstances that nobody's going to help them with. Absolutely nobody. Like in Almost Mercy, nobody's going to do anything about the injustices that Emily and Jackson have suffered. And, you know, the things that have happened to both of them are just, they're really horrifying in and of themselves. Or in something like Teeth, for example, you know, all the people who try to sexually assault Dawn, any woman who watches that film, she's lived in the skin. You know, what it means to just walk down the street and know that you're always on display. To know that, you know, if you're in a certain place at a certain time, you need to be on your guard. Take out your keys and make them into a weapon, or do whatever you need to do to protect yourself, even though, you know, the vast majority of people that are going to sexually assault somebody else are known to the victim. But, you know, we're still kind of habituated to this idea that it's dangerous for us out there, and it kind of is in a lot of ways still. And, you know, and if you get attacked, good luck getting anybody to take you seriously. It really depends on who you are and where you are. But, you know, if you get to take something like this to trial, you know, suddenly all of everything you've ever done is on trial. And it's not like, say, if, you know, the victim of, say, a mugging, we wouldn't ask that person, you know, well, have you ever in your life walked around somewhere where you might be mugged? And blame them. So, you know, I mean, it's a little bit of both, I think. You know, it still perpetuates some of these regressive gender roles, but there's also some questioning in them. And I really felt like there was some questioning of these things in Teeth. and Jennifer's Body, because, you know, there's just kind of no easy way to look at these characters as either slashers or final girls. When we're talking about Needy or Dawn, and, you know, they're kind of both. Yeah.
So you briefly mentioned it earlier, but are there any interesting differences between American slasher films and slasher films from other countries?
You know, that's a good question. And I think the slasher film is still a mostly American genre. You have some British slasher films, but they're pretty much the same thing. So, you know, wouldn't we say, like, if you asked me that question about another really American genre, which is the zombie narrative, and there are tremendous differences between the way we have, you know, American zombie narratives are told and narratives in other countries, like, you know, yes, yeah, Train to Busan. But, you know, in every American film since Romero, at least, you know, somebody's got a gun and they know how to use it, and that's just kind of a given. And then, you know, if you've seen something like Shaun of the Dead, which is a parody of the American zombie film, one of the comic moments is whether or not that gun in the Winchester, that rifle above, is actually a functioning rifle or not, because this is the UK and people don't have guns the way they do here. And then when they finally get their hands on the gun, they don't really know how to work it at first. So, and then there's this Swedish vampire novel, not vampire, zombie novel called Bury the Dead or something like that, by this guy. He's John Lindquist. He's like Sweden's Stephen King. And there, when the dead start returning to life, the government has to start a program to house these people, to figure out what should be done with them. And, you know, suddenly you can't call them zombies. That's a derisive term. They have to be called the reliving, and they have to be treated in very special ways. They're not to be terminated with extreme prejudice. So you have these huge differences in the way different cultures see zombies. Or Train to Busan is as much a commentary on how in South Korea people are locked into very stereotypical roles, you know, and dominator models of controlling people, as much as zombies. And, you know, like with any zombie narrative, you question, who are the real zombies? The living dead or the humans? But, you know, slasher's still kind of something that it hasn't popped up in other countries as a genre. I don't know why. They just don't, you know, you see a lot of ghost narratives, of course, which are just universal, vampires, and even zombies. But slasher, it's not really something that's caught on. I'm not sure why. Although there are other things that are, you know, kind of close to them. But I'm thinking about some South American movie about a family of cannibals that it's kind of like that. Which one?
I was going to say Cannibal Holocaust, but that's
No, that's Italian. That's a giallo. And yeah, that one is just, it's one I haven't watched because they used a live monkey in that. And there's this famous scene where the monkey, they bust into the monkey's skull and eat its brains, and the monkey's alive, and I don't want to watch it. I just can't. Yeah.
The sort of the juxtaposition of the male slasher and female slasher is kind of interesting. Can you do like a compare and contrast from, say, a perspective of hero and villain?
Yeah, actually, you know, so for the male slasher, he's not really completely stepping out of his gender role. Extreme violence is an extreme iteration of normative femininity. For instance, compare this to something like, say, the werewolf film or the werewolf narrative. And, you know, the werewolf is this creature that, you know, is really hairy, has excessive appetites for food, for sex, for violence, and it's like a very extreme version of normative masculinity. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is like a werewolf story without a werewolf. in that way. And, you know, I'd say that for the male slasher, it's an extreme iteration of normative masculinity. You know, it's the threat of the slasher or somebody like the slasher that keeps everything in place because, you know, it's just that kind of threat that causes women to stay on their guard, to watch how they behave. Whereas for the female slasher, you know, she's on the one hand going against gender type, but on the other hand, you know, I think there are some characteristics of the hero in her. And that's because of how the audience thinks about the characters while watching the slasher film. I mean, of course we identify with the victims, but, you know, we have to admit we also identify with the killers in some way, even if we don't want to, because, you know, even the earliest films, they're told from the killer's perspective. You know, we're watching the killer killing his victims. So, for instance, in Peeping Tom, where you have this person who's a director trying to get into legitimate film and moonlighting as a pornographic director at night, we have to see the killing from his perspective through his special camera that's got this knife that comes out and stabs his victims, and he's able to record their death throes and watch them again. So whether you like it or not, you're kind of forced to identify with the killer in traditional slasher films, and you know, whether you feel uncomfortable with that or not, and I think most people do, you're kind of forced to do that. But when people watch slasher films with female slashers, you know, depending on what they're doing and why, that identification is a lot more complicated because, you know, on the one hand, I mean, their anger is justified. It's pretty extreme, but you can't blame them for being mad. And it's not like, say, with the killer in a traditional slasher film, like, why would you want to kill those women? What's wrong with you? So, I mean, I hope that answers your question.
It was adjacent, but it brings up another sort of interesting point. Like the last thing that you said, in comparing the two, that it's, I forget the phrase that you used, like almost justified whenever there's a female slasher, or like you can understand the reason behind it.
Yeah, I think I said she has her reasons.
Yeah, she has her reasons, right?
Yeah.
And so those reasons are understandable, acceptable, something, but she has her reasons.
She has reasons that she can articulate, and they are somewhat understandable, you know, depending on which film you're talking about.
And with the presentation of the male, I thought the reason behind that was like upbringing and childhood, traumatic events and things like that. So that it would seem to me they both have a causal nature and they're both understandable.
Yes, exactly. And you know, the women are.
There's a difference, and so I'm trying to reconcile that they're the same but different.
Well, and the women are victimized because they're female, because behaving in stereotypical feminine ways also sets you up for victimization very often. But, you know, they're also fighting back, and, you know, not only that, when these, you know, some of the characters in the fourth wave slasher films are, like, really so far from being anybody that should be blamed. So, for instance, in Teeth, Dawn is this born-again Christian, and she's the president of her school's chapter of True Love Waits. It's one of these purity movements, and she's got a purity ring, and she pledges to not have sex until marriage, and she and her friends, when they go out, they do things like they won't even watch a movie that's not G-rated because it might be too sexual. And then, you know, her boyfriend, who's supposedly sworn to this, well, he's actually had sex before and now he regrets it. And then he rapes her. He won't stop when she tells him stop, and she kills him. She doesn't mean to, but her body's defending herself, and she kills him. And, you know, and it goes from her using that part of her body, her extra set of teeth, in purely defensive ways to which she's violated, to ending with, she's just kind of inviting it to happen. And if you are bad enough to do that, to try to take advantage of her, well, that's your fault.
Now that gets really interesting.
It's complicated.
Because there's almost a moral component in that presentation of if you're bad enough, i.e. if you're deserving, and you engage in a certain behavior, and I'm sort of abstracting a little bit to generalize, if you are engaging in certain behaviors and you are deserving of this punishment, so to speak, then okay, fine, you receive the punishment. But I don't remember that sort of presentation for the males, because with the males it's kind of like, well, at the abstract layer, here are these girls engaging in, socially unacceptable or morally unacceptable behavior, and so they're just sort of getting what they deserve. So it seemed like the concept of getting what they deserve applies in those circumstances, but it here in both.
Yeah,
And
no.
Is there a difference, or am I just making stuff up?
No, I think there is a difference, and then with Dawn, it's complicated again, because, usually the women in slasher films that are targeted for the killer are women who have, for instance, had improper sex, and Dawn is the opposite of this, but everybody who violates her is having improper sex. And so you take it out of this kind of really stiff, moralistic category that, even when the slasher film became a thing, we were questioning these ideas, to looking at it in another way completely, like who are the people really having the improper sex, like sex that's non-consensual, or who are really the people doing the bad things. In Almost Mercy, is it Emily and Jackson? And I'm not really endorsing anybody who becomes a school shooter, and that's thwarted in the film. But if you see all the awful things that have happened to both of them, like they've been raped, they've been beaten up by their peers. Adults have raped them, like a priest. One of their classmates was killed by an angry father who came home and caught his wife cheating and killed the whole family. And the parents are everywhere from, like, Jackson's stepfather abuses him when he can, to Emily's parents, who are just, the mom is just really sad, trying to win back the dad's love by whatever means, and the dad is in this really lurid sexual relationship with her school teacher who hates her. And it's this, kind of funny, actually, BDSM relationship, but she kills him too because of what he's done to her mother. And, before she goes to kill her father, she meets with her mother who's dying and says, "You're always such a good girl." It's just like, wow. And, that's a really poignant line because, and this is what being a good girl gets her. If she's a good girl in the more traditional sense of the word, she's just supposed to suffer in silence all these things that have happened to her and her best friend. But being a good girl by taking care of, by killing her father, who's hurt her mother so much, that's not gotten her much either. She's going to be in a mental institution the rest of her life. Jackson's the only one who gets any freedom in that film. So yeah, I think as the film evolves, just our ideas of these roles have to evolve, and they get really complicated, and it's not easy to pull one or the other apart because they're all mixed up with each other. These roles are actually, if you think about it, you could think of them as different parts of the human mind. The slasher is the character who does all the antisocial things that we might think about sometimes, but we don't actually do those things because we don't do them. Like when you're a little kid, you get trained pretty fast. There are certain things you don't do. You don't go smack your little brother or your little sister for taking your toy because that's not nice. But the slasher is this antisocial part of ourselves, and the victim is the other part, the person who just behaves the way that we usually behave, thinking that we're safe, that everything's okay, and it turns out it's not. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how queerness gets very entangled with the archetype of the male slasher specifically?
Oh, I think there's queerness throughout the genre because of how the genre was ahead of its time in looking at gender as a malleable, shifting category constantly, and it is not something that is inextricably linked to sex. So yeah, it's queer all over the place in multiple ways.
I was thinking especially how I feel like there's almost a metaphor to be said when you look at the archetype of more of the phase one slasher,
Yeah,
where it's more of a demonization of that idea, as opposed to when you get into more modern slasher works where that idea is no longer demonized as much as just mixed in with all the other knots of
well, a film I identified as being a fourth phase slasher film, High Tension from 2003, it's a French film. Actually, you know, that film got a lot of negative critical reception because of its more traditional representation of queerness. You have this, you have a lesbian character who is in love with this, her classmate. The classmate doesn't return her love. They've just come back from some spring break trip to Ibiza before going to stay with the victim's family, and you know, the main character, the slasher, she's calling her friend a slut because she you know, has been doing things on Ibiza, like she stayed out all night with some guy she just met, and it was really excoriated as just something that was, you know, a typical representation of people who weren't cis-het as being inherently mentally unbalanced and dangerous. And then, you know, there's Jennifer's body too, and the relationship between Needy and Jennifer. And, you know, some of their friends tease them, you know, Needy's narrating it and saying, you know, like how much she loved her best friend, and sandbox love never dies, and that opening scene where Jennifer's the head of the flag team and Needy's in the stands just waving at her like this, and the mean class like back just says something like, oh, you're lesbian gay. And but you know, there is this connection between these two women that, I mean, and it goes to being very close to sexual too. And you know what it means, it's up to those two women to decide. But I think that film really complicates ideas of queerness and women's friendships, and how culture works to just cut apart the bonds between women, because, you know, those are seen as threatening. If women can have bonds with each other through life, it means, hey, you know, they can swap notes and be a mutual support for one another, and rebel against things that they know are unjust. And then, you know, there's Needy's last name, Lesnicki, which isn't an accident either. And, you know, and there's all the joking about the relationship between these two girls and what the nature of it really is. But, you know, the only thing you can really see is they were really close best friends until they weren't. And when Jennifer is possessed by a demon, it's as if she is the most cis-het woman ever, which makes her really dangerous in this language, because, you know, she's more like a vampire in that way, or a succubus. She's a femme fatale, you know, a woman who can use her beauty to lure people to their deaths, and she's very good at that. In fact, you know, to keep looking good, she's got to, you know, have a continuous intake of victims, or she just starts looking like, you know, she hasn't gotten enough sleep, or her skin's dry and dull, and then after she takes a victim, she's glowing, she's beautiful again. And she's irresistible to pretty much anybody who sees her.
The whole idea of the succubus has always been such an interesting archetype to me.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a male equivalent, but you really don't hear about that one as much. The incubus, you know, it's the succubus, this demon who comes to men, especially at night, and has sex with them in their dreams and sucks away their power. And, you know, if you know anything about the early modern witch hunts, a common accusation of somebody who was being accused, you know, a common thing levied against somebody who was accused of witchcraft was that this person had made a neighbor impotent. Maybe come to this person in the night and had sex with this person, or done something else to make that person impotent. It's kind of interesting. You know, that along with other things like, you know, the witch lays waste to the crops and causes stillborn, you know, women to have stillborn pregnancies, and, you know, the livestock all have stillborn births, and and what have you. Well, do I have any other questions you guys could answer? Or would like me to answer, I'm sorry. It's kind of silly.
And what's your favorite slasher franchise?
Oh, I actually like the Halloween one, and I really am a fan of the one that came out a few years ago. And Lori is older now. She's a grandmother, and it shows how she's been really, you don't just walk away from this and it's fine afterwards. There's all this damage that's been done to her emotionally. And she's got PTSD basically, and her family thinks she's crazy because she lives in this compound that's got all these cameras and fences above it, and she's got this secret hiding hole full of all kinds of weapons she can go to. And her granddaughter believes her. Her daughter thinks she's crazy, but it turns out that she needs these things to survive because, this guy, he's coming back for her, and there's no stopping him. And in some, in a way, she's right. If you look at the slasher as the embodiment of patriarchal oppression, then it's not going away anytime soon. And it doesn't have to look like the Taliban either. So.
Yeah, I saw the new trailer for the new one coming out. I don't know, Halloween something, but it's just on in theaters.
And I'm
still
so
happening. He's still alive.
I'm so old. I actually saw Halloween when it premiered in theater. So yeah, but yeah, I like that franchise. One of the big three that became franchises when franchising became a thing in the '80s. The one I never really liked was Friday the 13th. Because it's kind of an afterthought, and the people who created it said, hey, we want to cash in on all these slasher films. Let's make something kind of like it. So they made something on the cheap, and it became its own franchise, which, is really admirable. But I don't know, the story itself was like, Nightmare on Elm Street's got something special, and you want to talk about queerness. I think it's the second one. Freddie is visiting this young man who's struggling with his own sexuality. He's trying to come out to himself. And, it's interesting commentary on that. But, I don't know, Friday the 13th, I actually like the way the Final Girls parodies Friday the 13th a lot better than Friday the 13th. And what I really loved about Final Girls when I show it to my students is like guess all the places in Baton Rouge where that was filmed. I can recognize all those places. And I'm guessing like that one scene in the church before, before Max and her mother Amanda go out and they have to confront, the killer. That looks like it was in the Burden Rural Life Museum, and I'm pretty sure they had somebody just go shoot it because they weren't going to let people shoot a film in there and do those things. I'm getting more sensitive to being able to tell when they've used green screen. And one change that's really taken off in the 21st century is the use of green screen, where you don't even have to have your actors on the set. You just create the set around them, and it lets you be more flexible. It's a lot easier. And it's safer too. Like, that scene where the killer is flying through the window and he's on fire. I mean, I don't even know if they had a stuntman that was actually on fire or not, or they just put some flames on him, but yeah. But that's really fun looking through that film and noticing all the places in Baton Rouge where it was filmed. And I was surprised how many of them I just knew without even knowing. Like the place where Amanda's killed, that's a continuous loop of Government Street. Yeah.
Have you ever read the book It Devours? It very much plays on horror stereotypes by Jeffrey Craner.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it, no.
I think it's a very good, it very much exemplifies a lot of the sticky areas of modern horror.
I gotta check that out. I just read the Final Girl Support Group, which I really like, and I'm teaching it later this fall. And that's a good kind of meta-generic novel as well. But yeah, I'll have to read that one.
Fair warning, it's less slasher related and more horror in general.
That's cool. I mean, I'm not really single-minded in my tastes. I like a lot of different types of horror. I like a lot of different types of media. You know, like there's probably a bigger list of things I do like than what I don't like, and I just can't stand. Like I cannot stand traditional romance. I do not like Hallmark Channel things.
You're gonna love this book.
Cool. Cool. Well, that's good to know. Yeah.
I have one last question. before I
Sure.
Get out here. Would you consider the 2003 film Monster about the serial killer, the female serial killer? I can't remember her name.
Eileen Warner.
Eileen Wuornos.
Yeah.
No, that's not a slasher film. That's a serial killer film.
But would you consider in that fourth layer of?
I really wouldn't, because the way the story's told, it's told as a serial killer film,
Okay.
where you know
It's like a postmodern horror film. It's like
It is.
It's not really a drama all the way.
and you know there's a lot of things that intersect too. Like there's a lot of serial killer films where you know the serial killer is mortal. The serial killer has to die at some point, but you know there's something about this killer that's almost immortal. Like if you look at Hannibal Lecter in all the incarnations, like my favorite one, Mads Malkin. But you know, even if you've read the books, yeah, oh god, he's the
I
best
love
one
Mads
ever.
Mikkelsen.
Yeah, he's way better than Anthony Hopkins. You know, you could really see a girl giving up her career with the FBI to run off with him.
Right?
Yeah, you know, even he's not immortal. He's going to die. And we know this with Eileen Wuornos too, although I think the way that film is shot, there's a lot in common with the slasher film, especially like the fourth wave ones. Like, she does have her reasons. You know, these people are pretty horrible to her, but then what happens in that film, as with each successive victim, just like in Jennifer's Body, you really can't keep that stance for long with the killer because the victims become more sympathetic. And the last one is just like, you know, he's some minister, he doesn't mean to cause her any harm, and, you know, he just, I forgot if he's buying sex off of her or not, but, you know, whether he is or not, he's not gonna hurt her. And so, you know, it does follow some of the rules of the slasher film in that way too. I mean, you know, for instance, in Jennifer's Body, Jennifer's victims go from being kind of comic to, it's just kind of sad that she's done these things. And when she kills Needy's boyfriend, it's just, oh man, it's so horrible. So, yeah.
That's fair.
But I like serial killer stuff too. It's really, yeah, I mean, I like it, but then I get very annoyed with it too because a lot of it seems like FBI propaganda.
Yeah.
Having lived through the period of 3 serial killers here, and when we were all like terrified because Derek Todd Lee wasn't even caught, and you know the FBI came down here, ignored our local law enforcement, and said, no, it's a white man, and he's got a white truck, and we know exactly what he looks like because this fits our profile, and you know, and he kills women this way, and it turned out, well, he didn't fit the profile, and he was killing women all kinds of ways, just like the second serial killer, Sean Vincent Gillis, and it kind of broke all of their stereotypes and profiling. So, I don't know, I get kind of annoyed with serial killer films that still adhere to this idea that the FBI can find them and, you know, they have all this great information when they really don't sometimes.
This is great.
Yeah, this has been a lot of
I
fun.
loved
I
it.
enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for asking me. It's been fun.